Hey there, travelers. Before we dive into today's story, drop a comment below telling us where you're tuning in from. Now let's begin our journey into the unknown. 3 weeks ago, I was leading a routine Arctic research expedition. Now, I'm the only survivor of something that should never have been disturbed. The wind howled across the frozen wasteland as our snowcat approached the coordinates. March in northern Alaska means endless white stretching to every horizon, temperatures that can kill you in minutes, and isolation so complete that help might as well be on another planet. But that's exactly where we needed to be. Jesus, Peter. You sure about these readings? Dr. Fabien Franz called from the passenger seat, his breath fogging the reinforced glass. Fabien was our Franklin expedition specialist. If anyone could make sense of what we'd found, it was him. I checked the GPS coordinates again. Dead on target, 2 miles northeast of our last survey point. Behind us, Lieutenant Bernie Gallner sat rigid, his military training evident even in the cramped vehicle. The Department of Defense had insisted on military escort for this expedition, though they wouldn't say why. Bernie's pale blue eyes constantly scanned the horizon through his tactical goggles. "Contact in 5 minutes," came Eric Foster's voice through the comm system. Our communications specialist was barely 22, fresh out of MIT, and this was his first Arctic deployment. Kid was brilliant with electronics, but had no idea what we were really looking for. Dr. Holly Seifert, our virologist on loan from a Russian research station, remained silent in the back. She'd been unusually quiet since we'd briefed her on the mission parameters. Her dark eyes held secrets I hadn't learned to read yet. The truth is, none of them knew the real reason we were here. The official mission was geological surveys and climate data collection. Standard stuff. But 3 months ago, ground-penetrating radar had detected something extraordinary beneath the ice, the perfectly preserved remains of 2 ships, locked in a glacier for nearly 2 centuries. The HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. Sir John Franklin's lost expedition. There, I pointed ahead. That ridge formation. Our snowcat climbed the small rise, tracks biting into the packed snow. When we crested the hill, the sight that greeted us defied everything we thought we knew about Arctic preservation. 2 massive wooden ships sat encased in a wall of blue-white ice, their masts and rigging visible through the frozen surface like insects trapped in amber. The glacier had split around them, creating a natural viewing chamber. After 180 years, they looked like they could sail tomorrow. My God, Fabien breathed. They're intact, completely intact. Bernie was already on his radio. "Base, this is Gallner. We have visual confirmation on the targets. Beginning site establishment. Copy that, Gallner. Remember, this site is classified level 7. No outside communication." Eric was setting up his equipment, but his hands shook, and not from the cold. "Doc Libert, how is this possible? Ships don't preserve like this. Not for almost 2 centuries. I didn't have an answer. Ships buried in ice usually get crushed by the immense pressure. These vessels sat perfectly preserved, as if time had simply stopped. Holly finally spoke, her Russian accent thick with concern. "Peter, I need to ask you something privately." We stepped away from the others. The wind carried her words away before they could reach the team. "This expedition," she said quietly, "it's not about climate research, is it?" I met her gaze. "What makes you ask that?" "Because 3 weeks ago, my government contacted me about unusual readings from this exact region. Biological signatures that shouldn't exist at these temperatures." She pulled out a tablet showing thermal imaging data. "Something in those ships registers organic activity." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the Arctic wind. "Holly, what kind of biological signatures? The kind that suggests preserved organic matter with active cellular structure?" We worked for 6 hours extracting what we came for. Using heated cutting tools, we carved through the ice wall until we reached the Terror's crew quarters. Inside, we found what we'd been sent to retrieve. A single crew member, perfectly preserved in a block of ice. But as we examined him more closely, something was wrong. His limbs were elongated, joints bent at impossible angles. His face was human, but the bone structure underneath seemed shifted, distorted. "Look at the rib cage," Fabien whispered, his archaeological training taking over. "It's expanded, like something was growing inside." The body was wrapped in the remnants of a Royal Navy uniform, but the fabric had somehow fused with the skin in places. Dark veins ran beneath the preserved flesh, creating intricate patterns that seemed almost deliberate. We need to get this back to the research station, I decided. Full analysis in a controlled environment. Peter, Holly said, examining tissue samples through her portable microscope. The cellular structure is unlike anything I've encountered. The cells appear to be in some kind of suspended animation, but they're not dead. Bernie helped us load the ice block containing the crew member onto a specialized transport sled. Doc, maybe we should leave it here. Something feels wrong about this whole thing. This could rewrite everything we know about the Franklin expedition, Fabienne argued. We can't just walk away from the discovery of the century. The journey back to our research station took 3 hours. Station Alpha 7 was a state-of-the-art facility built into the side of a mountain, powered by geothermal energy and designed to withstand the harshest Arctic conditions. Our laboratory was equipped with everything needed for biological analysis. Once inside, we placed the ice block in the main lab's thawing chamber. I set the temperature controls to gradually warm the specimen over several hours. Eric, make sure all monitoring equipment is recording, I instructed. I want full documentation of this process. Already on it, Doc. Cameras, sensors, the works. Holly prepared her analysis equipment, while Fabienne documented every detail of the uniform and personal effects visible through the ice. Bernie stationed himself by the lab entrance, though I wasn't sure what he thought he was guarding against. As the ice began to melt, the smell hit us first. Not the expected odor of decay, but something else, metallic, almost ozone-like, with an underlying sweetness that made my stomach turn. Temperatures rising faster than expected, Eric reported. The ice is melting at an accelerated rate. I checked the thawing chamber controls. Everything was set correctly, but the ice was indeed disappearing more quickly than physics should allow. Peter. Holly's voice was tight with concern. Look at this. Through her microscope viewer, I could see the tissue samples she'd taken earlier. The cells that had appeared dormant were now clearly active, dividing and restructuring at a visible rate. It's like the warming process triggered some kind of biological restart, she explained. The cellular activity is increasing exponentially. As the last of the ice melted away, we could see the full extent of the body's deformations. The limbs were elongated, joints swollen and repositioned. The face, while recognizably human, had a stretched quality, as if the skull beneath had been reshaped. But the eyes remained closed, lifeless. Definitely deceased, I confirmed after checking for any signs of life. No pulse, no brain activity. Just a remarkably preserved corpse. Holly began extracting tissue samples from various parts of the body. The cellular structure is fascinating. Unlike anything I've seen before, the cells appear to have been modified somehow. Fabienne documented every detail while Bernie maintained his position by the door, though he seemed more relaxed now that we'd confirmed the body was truly dead. Look at these tissue readings, Holly said, placing a sample under the main laboratory microscope. The cells are restructuring even as I watch them. It's like they're trying to rebuild themselves into something else. I leaned over to examine the sample. The cells were indeed moving, reorganizing into patterns that seemed almost purposeful. Could be some kind of post-mortem cellular activity triggered by the warming process. That's when we noticed the chest cavity beginning to expand. Is that normal for decomposition? Eric asked nervously. No, Holly replied, stepping back from the examination table. That's not normal at all. The body's ribcage continued to distend, pushing outward as if something inside was growing. The skin stretched and began to discolor, turning a sickly greenish black. Everyone move away from the table, I ordered, but none of us could look away. A wet, tearing sound filled the laboratory as something began pushing against the inside of the chest cavity. The sternum cracked audibly, and dark fluid started seeping through the skin. Peter, we need to leave. Now, Bernie said, his military instincts finally kicking in. But before any of us could move, the chest exploded outward in a shower of blood and decomposed tissue. Something wet and writhing burst through the ribcage, sending fragments of bone and gore across the laboratory walls. The creature that emerged was the size of a small dog, but moved with an alien fluidity. Its body was translucent, revealing pulsing organs beneath glistening skin. Multiple appendages sprouted from its core, each ending in what looked like tiny hands with too many fingers. It made a sound like a newborn's cry mixed with the clicking of insects, its multiple eyes scanning the room before focusing on us with unmistakable intelligence. Blood dripped from the laboratory ceiling where droplets had splattered during its violent birth. The air filled with the stench of copper and rot. That's when Eric screamed. Eric's scream cut through the laboratory like broken glass. The creature that had burst from the corpse's chest moved with unnatural speed, its translucent body rippling as multiple appendages searched the air like blind fingers seeking warmth. "Nobody move!" Bernie shouted, his weapon trained on the writhing mass. But the thing was too fast, too unpredictable. It skittered across the blood-soaked floor with movements that defied every law of biology I knew. For a moment, it seemed to hesitate, its multiple eyes scanning each of us. Then, with horrifying deliberation, it launched itself directly at Eric's face. "Get it off me! Get it off me!" Eric screamed, clawing at the creature as it wrapped its appendages around his head. Its body began forcing itself against his mouth, trying to push inside. Bernie fired 3 shots, but the bullets passed harmlessly through the creature's translucent form. Eric stumbled backward, fighting desperately as the thing compressed itself, becoming more fluid with each passing second. "Help him!" Holly screamed, but there was nothing we could do. The creature had forced its way into Eric's mouth, his throat bulging grotesquely as the entire organism disappeared inside him. Eric collapsed to his knees, gasping and retching. Dark fluid poured from his nose and ears. His body convulsed violently as something moved beneath his skin, traveling through his torso like a living tumor. "Eric, can you hear me?" I called out, keeping my distance. He looked up at me, and his eyes were no longer his own. They had taken on that same translucent quality as the creature, and I could see something writhing behind his pupils. When Eric stood up, his movements were wrong, too fluid, too coordinated. He smiled, but the expression belonged to something else entirely. "Thank you," Eric said, but his voice had an underlying harmonic that made my skin crawl. "This form is much more functional." That's when his transformation began. Eric's face started elongating, his jaw unhinging like a snake's. Additional eyes began pushing through the skin along his temples and forehead, not growing naturally but forcing their way through like parasites breaking the surface. Each new eye was fully formed, blinking independently as they focused on different members of our team. His arms stretched and twisted, new joints forming with wet popping sounds. Tentacles emerged from his back, tearing through his lab coat in sprays of blood and tissue. But his legs remained human, adapted to carry his increasingly alien torso. "The host's memories are fascinating," Eric Thing said, tilting its head at an impossible angle. "Eric Foster, age 22, fears heights and misses his girlfriend Sarah back in Boston. Such limited concerns." Bernie opened fire again, this time aiming for center mass. The bullet struck Eric Thing but barely slowed it down. Dark fluid oozed from the wounds, but they began sealing immediately. "Conventional weapons are ineffective," Eric Thing observed clinically. "This organism has experienced military conflict before." It moved toward Holly with predatory grace. One of its tentacles whipped out, striking her across the face and sending her crashing into the equipment tables. Laboratory instruments scattered across the floor in a cascade of broken glass and metal. Fabien tried to run, but Eric Thing was faster. A tentacle wrapped around the archaeologist's neck, lifting him off the ground. Fabien clawed at the appendage, his face turning purple as it constricted. "Fascinating genetic material," Eric Thing said, studying Fabien like a specimen. "Strong bones, good lung capacity. You'll serve well." The tentacle around Fabien's neck suddenly sprouted needle-like projections that pierced his skin. Fabien's struggles became frantic as something was injected directly into his bloodstream. Within seconds, his eyes rolled back, and he went limp. But Eric Thing wasn't done with him. It brought Fabien's unconscious form closer to its transformed face, and I watched in horror as Eric Thing's jaw unhinged completely. Rows of needle-sharp teeth became visible as it prepared to force itself into Fabien's mouth. "Stop!" I shouted, grabbing a portable flame unit from Holly's equipment. "Let him go!" Eric Thing paused, multiple eyes focusing on me with alien curiosity. "Dr. Peter Libert, marine biologist. You have extensive knowledge of parasitic organisms. your expertise would be valuable. Bernie managed to get behind it and grabbed Fabien's legs, trying to pull him free from the creature's grasp. But Eric Thing's tentacles were incredibly strong, and Bernie was losing ground. That's when the alarm system activated. Red lights bathed the laboratory as the emergency klaxon echoed through the station. Bernie must have triggered the security alert somehow. "Security breach in Laboratory 7, came the automated voice. "Armed response team en route." Eric Thing's head snapped toward the laboratory door. "More hosts," it said with what sounded like satisfaction. The laboratory door burst open, and 4 armed security personnel rushed in, weapons raised. Their leader, Sergeant Martinez, took one look at the scene and immediately opened fire. This time, the coordinated assault had more effect. Multiple high-caliber rounds struck Eric Thing simultaneously, and while the creature didn't fall, it released Fabien and recoiled. "What the hell is that thing?" Martinez shouted, continuing to fire. "Unknown biological threat!" I yelled back. "It's taken over one of our team members!" Eric Thing let out a sound that was part scream, part roar. Its tentacles lashed out wildly, catching one of the security guards across the chest and tearing through his body armor like paper. The man's ribs cracked audibly as he was hurled against the wall. Another guard tried to flank Eric Thing but was caught by a tentacle around the ankle. The creature lifted him upside down and slammed him repeatedly against the laboratory floor until his helmet cracked and blood began pooling beneath his head. Martinez kept firing, but his remaining ammunition was running low. "We need to evacuate the laboratory," he commanded. But Eric Thing had other plans. With horrifying speed, it launched itself at Martinez, multiple tentacles wrapping around the sergeant's torso. Martinez screamed as the appendages began crushing his ribs, but his cries were cut short when one of the tentacles forced itself into his mouth. I could see Eric Thing's body contracting rhythmically, pumping something into Martinez's throat. The sergeant's struggles grew weaker until he hung limp in the creature's grasp. Bernie and I managed to pull Fabien's unconscious form toward the emergency exit, while Holly gathered what data she could from her equipment. The remaining security guard was barely conscious, bleeding heavily from his head wound. "We have to get out of here," I shouted. But as we reached the door, Eric Thing finished with Martinez and turned toward us. The sergeant's body dropped to the floor, but I could see his chest still moving. Dark veins were already spreading beneath his skin. Eric Thing looked directly at me with its multiple eyes. "You cannot escape, Dr. Libert. This station is isolated. No rescue is coming. Soon, everyone here will join us." Instead of smashing through the window, it turned toward the laboratory door. The creature moved with terrifying purpose, its human legs carrying its grotesque transformed torso through the corridors of Station Alpha 7. Bernie tried to follow, but I grabbed his arm. "Don't. We need to tend to the wounded and figure out what we're dealing with." But through the reinforced walls, we could hear the sounds of Eric Thing's rampage echoing through the station. Screams punctuated by the wet sounds of tearing flesh. The emergency alarm continued its relentless wailing as the creature methodically worked its way toward the exit. A geologist working late was the first to encounter it in the main corridor. Her terrified screams echoed through the ventilation system before being cut short by a sickening crunch. Through the security monitors, we watched Eric Thing emerge from around the corner, dark fluid dripping from its tentacles. "Jesus Christ," Bernie whispered, staring at the monitor. "It's hunting them." But Eric Thing wasn't hunting. It was simply removing obstacles. The creature moved with single-minded purpose through the station, heading directly toward the exit. Anyone who got in its path was eliminated with brutal efficiency. In the cafeteria, a maintenance worker tried to hide behind the serving counter. Eric Thing didn't pause to search for him. It simply smashed through the barrier with its tentacles, grabbed the man, and snapped his neck with a quick twist before continuing its advance. The communications room presented a different problem. A technician was frantically trying to send a distress signal when Eric Thing burst through the door. Without hesitation, the creature destroyed every piece of equipment in the room with sweeping motions of its appendages, then killed the technician with a single strike to the chest. It wasn't interested in studying the technology. It just wanted to ensure no calls for help could get out. In the medical bay, 2 doctors were treating a patient when Eric Thing smashed through the door. The first doctor was caught by a tentacle and hurled against the wall with bone-crushing force. The second tried to run, but was caught at the doorway, his spine severed by a precise strike. The patient on the table was killed last, a quick, efficient motion that crushed his windpipe. The creature showed no curiosity about the medical equipment, no interest in the human anatomy it was destroying. It simply wanted these obstacles removed so it could continue toward its destination. The engineering section became a slaughterhouse. Eric Thing moved through the narrow corridors between machinery with relentless determination. 3 engineers were working on generator maintenance when it found them. The creature didn't pause. It simply grabbed the first man by both legs and swung him against the concrete walls until his skull cracked open. The second tried to climb into the ventilation shaft, but was pulled down by his ankles, his body hitting the floor with a wet thud. The third engineer grabbed a welding torch and managed to sear one of Eric Thing's tentacles with the open flame. The creature recoiled with a metallic shriek, but instead of retreating, it immediately adapted. Using its other appendages, it destroyed the oxygen tanks feeding the torch, then killed the engineer with a swift strike to the head once the flame died. Eric Thing wasn't learning or studying. It was simply removing threats to its progress toward the exit. In the laboratory wing, it found a biochemist who had barricaded himself in a storage closet. The creature didn't wait or play games. It simply tore the door off its hinges and killed the man with a single tentacle thrust through the chest. The station's library presented no obstacle at all. An elderly researcher tried to hide behind the stacks, but Eric Thing smashed through the shelves like they were paper, grabbed the man, and broke his neck without slowing its forward momentum. Every death served the same purpose, clearing the path to the exit. The creature had no interest in torture, no curiosity about human behavior. It was driven by a single, overwhelming imperative: return to the ships. The creature reached the main corridor leading to the station's exit. That's where it encountered the bulk of our security force. 6 heavily armed guards had set up a defensive position behind overturned tables and equipment crates. Unknown entity. "Stop where you are!" Sergeant Hoff commanded through a megaphone. "We are authorized to use lethal force!" Eric Thing paused, tilting its head as if considering the warning. Then it smiled with Eric's mouth, though the expression was twisted by the additional eyes that had sprouted across its face. "Lethal force," it repeated in Eric's distorted voice. How quaint. The firefight was brutal and chaotic. The guards had prepared defensive positions, but Eric Thing moved like nothing they'd ever encountered. It used the walls and ceiling as much as the floor, its tentacles finding purchase on pipes and support beams. The creature weathered the initial barrage, bullets tearing through its translucent flesh, but causing no apparent lasting damage. Dark fluid leaked from the wounds, but they sealed themselves within seconds. Davis tried to coordinate his men's fire. Concentrate on the torso. Take out its center mass. But Eric Thing was learning their tactics in real time. It grabbed a broken piece of equipment and hurled it at one guard, crushing his chest plate and sending him flying backward. Another guard tried to flank around through the maintenance corridor, but Eric Thing anticipated the move and was waiting for him. The guard's screams echoed through the walls as tentacles dragged him deeper into the maintenance area. When Eric Thing emerged alone minutes later, its appendages were stained with fresh blood. "Fall back," Davis commanded. "Reform at checkpoint 7. But Eric Thing had already identified the tactical leader. It launched itself directly at Hoff, moving faster than human reflexes could track. Hoff managed to get off 3 shots at point-blank range before tentacles wrapped around his rifle and crushed it like aluminum foil. "Nozick! Now!" Hoff screamed as Eric Thing lifted him off the ground. The sniper's shot was perfect. The .308 round caught Eric Thing directly in the center of its transformed head. Eric's skull exploded in a spray of brain matter and alien fluid. The creature released Hoff and toppled backward, its tentacles twitching spasmodically before going completely limp. "Target neutralized," Nozick called out, lowering his rifle. The remaining guards approached cautiously. Eric's body lay twisted and broken, his multiple eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling. Dark blood pooled around the massive head wound. Davis kicked the corpse hard. "Ugly son of a bitch. What the hell was it?" "Some kind of parasite," Rodriguez said, still keeping his rifle trained on the motionless form. "Never seen anything like it." That's when Eric's chest began to bulge outward. The guards scrambled backward as something large pressed against the inside of the ribcage. With a wet, tearing sound, the original creature burst through Eric's sternum in an explosion of gore and broken ribs. The parasite had grown significantly during its time inside Eric's body. Its translucent form now pulsed with dark veins, and new appendages had developed along its sides. Multiple eyes dotted its surface like malignant tumors, all focused on the terrified guards. "Open fire! Open fire!" Davis screamed. Davis. But the creature was no longer confined by a human host's limitations. It moved across the ceiling like liquid mercury, avoiding their shots with impossible agility. Rodriguez tried to track it with his rifle, but the parasite dropped directly onto his head before he could fire. The possession was violent and immediate. Rodriguez's skull cracked under the creature's weight as it forced itself through his mouth and nose simultaneously. His body convulsed as the parasite invaded his nervous system, rewriting his biology from the inside out. Within minutes, Rodriguez was transforming. His military training remained, but enhanced by alien intelligence and inhuman strength. Additional limbs erupted from his torso, each ending in serrated bone protrusions. His eyes multiplied and repositioned to provide complete battlefield awareness. The remaining guards didn't have time to process what they were seeing. Rodriguez's thing moved with lethal precision, using military combat techniques enhanced by otherworldly reflexes. It disarmed one guard by severing his hands at the wrists, then used the man's own weapon to kill his companion. Davis tried to run, but Rodriguez's thing was faster. A bone spur through the spine dropped the sergeant instantly. The creature didn't stop to admire its work. It simply continued its methodical advance toward the station's exit. Through the external cameras, we watched Rodriguez's thing emerge into the Arctic night. The creature paused at the threshold, its multiple eyes scanning the frozen landscape. Then, with purposeful strides, it began moving across the ice. "It's heading back to the excavation site," Holly observed, her voice hollow with shock. "Just like you predicted." I checked the thermal imaging display. The heat signature that had been Rodriguez was indeed moving directly toward the coordinates where we discovered the Franklin ships. But now we knew why. The creature wasn't just returning home. It was completing a journey that had been interrupted 180 years ago. "Bernie," I said, "how many people were in the station when this started?" He checked his personnel roster with shaking hands. 43 total, including us. I looked at the security monitors showing the carnage throughout Station Alpha 7. Bodies lay scattered through the corridors like discarded dolls. The creature had killed at least 15 people in its escape, maybe more. "We need to get out of here," I said. "Whatever that thing is, it's not finished, and when it gets to those ships..." "What do you think will happen?" Holly asked. "We need to get out of here," I said, looking at the carnage displayed on our monitors. "That thing has killed almost half the station personnel, and it's still heading toward the excavation site." "What do you think it wants there?" Holly asked, pressing a medical pad against the gash on her forehead. I stared at the thermal signature moving across the frozen landscape on our tracking display. The creature wasn't wandering aimlessly. Its path was direct, purposeful. But this wasn't some grand design that had been planned for centuries. This was pure survival instinct. "I think it's trying to get back to the only environment it knows can sustain it," I said. "Those ships were its habitat for 180 years. The ice preserved not just the crew member, but whatever ecosystem allowed the parasite to survive." Bernie was checking his equipment, preparing for what he knew was inevitable. "So, what's our next move, Doc? We can't let that thing reach populated areas." "We follow it," I said, "and we figure out how to kill it permanently." Fabien, still groggy from his encounter with Eric Thing, struggled to focus on his tablet. "The thermal readings from the excavation site. They're spiking. Something's happening out there." Through the external cameras, we watched Rodriguez's Thing disappear into the Arctic night. But even as it moved away from Station Alpha 7, I knew our nightmare was far from over. Behind us, the station's corridors were filled with the dead and dying. The creature had shown no mercy, no discrimination. Scientists, support staff, security personnel, all had fallen to its relentless advance. But more disturbing than the deaths was the creature's behavior. It wasn't just killing, it was learning. Each encounter had made it more efficient, more deadly. The parasite was adapting to our technology, our tactics, our weaknesses. And now it was returning to the place where it had waited in frozen sleep for nearly 2 centuries, carrying with it everything it had learned about the modern world. The snowcat's tracks bit deep into the frozen ground as we raced across the Arctic wasteland toward the excavation site. Behind us, Station Alpha 7 was a tomb of twisted metal and broken bodies. Ahead of us lay something far worse. "Thermal readings are off the charts," Holly said, her voice tight with fear as she monitored our instruments. "The ice around both ships is melting at an unprecedented rate." Through the reinforced windshield, I could see our destination. What had once been a pristine glacier containing two perfectly preserved ships was now a churning mass of steam and dark water. The HMS Erebus and HMS Terror were no longer trapped in ice. They were sitting in a rapidly expanding lake of black liquid. "Jesus," Bernie whispered, adjusting his rifle scope. "What the hell is that thing doing?" Nozick Thing stood at the water's edge, its transformed body silhouetted against the steaming lake. But it wasn't alone anymore. The creature had grown, massively. What had once been Private Nozick's human frame was now the core of something much larger, much more horrifying. Dozens of writhing appendages sprouted from the central mass, each one pulsing with alien life. The creature had somehow absorbed other parasites, creating a grotesque amalgamation of organic horror that defied description. Multiple faces pressed against the translucent flesh, human features distorted beyond recognition, their mouths opening and closing in silent screams. "It's awakening them," Fabien said, his archaeological mind struggling to process what we were seeing. "The other parasites in the ships, they're all connecting." As we watched in horror, more creatures began emerging from the dark water. They crawled out of the ship's hulls like maggots from rotting meat. Dozens of them, each one a translucent horror with multiple eyes and grasping tentacles. But instead of spreading out, they moved directly toward Nozick Thing, merging with its already bloated form. "We need to call for backup," I said, grabbing the emergency radio. "Military support, hazmat teams, everything we can get." "Peter," Holly's voice was barely a whisper, "look at the ships themselves." The wooden hulls of the Erebus and Terror were changing. Dark veins spread across their surfaces like infection, and the timber itself seemed to pulse with life. The ships weren't just containers for the parasites, they were becoming part of the organism. I keyed the radio with shaking hands. "Mayday, Mayday. This is Dr. Peter Libert at coordinates 77 North, 158 West. We have a biological catastrophe in progress. We need immediate military response, full hazmat protocols, heavy weapons, everything you can send." The response came faster than I expected. "Dr. Libert, this is Colonel Harrison, Arctic Command. We've been monitoring Station Alpha 7. Military assets are already en route. ETA 20 minutes. 20 minutes. We had to survive 20 minutes against something that had been waiting 180 years to complete its life cycle. The merged creature, I could no longer think of it as Nozick Thing, began to move. Its massive form rose from the water like a living mountain of flesh and tentacles. It was easily 30 feet tall now, a writhing mass of absorbed parasites and human remains. But it wasn't finished growing. "It's heading toward us," Bernie said, chambering around. But the creature wasn't interested in us yet. Instead, it positioned itself at the center of the lake and began a process that made my blood freeze. Its body contracted rhythmically, and with each pulse, it launched smaller parasites from its mass like living artillery. The projectiles arced through the air, traveling hundreds of meters before crashing into the snow around our position. Each impact created a crater of steaming slush, and from each crater, a parasite emerged, ready to find a new host. "Move! Everyone out of the vehicle!" I shouted. We abandoned the snowcat just as one of the projectile parasites smashed through its roof. The creature that emerged was smaller than the ones we'd seen before, but no less deadly. Its multiple eyes immediately fixed on Fabien, who was closest to the impact site. Bernie's rifle barked 3 times, the high-powered rounds tearing through the parasite's translucent body. Dark fluid sprayed across the snow, but the creature kept coming until Bernie's 4th shot finally dropped it. "More incoming!" Holly screamed. The sky filled with parasites as the mother creature continued its barrage. They fell like rain around our position, each one seeking a host, each one driven by the same alien hunger that had consumed Eric and Nozick. The sound of helicopter rotors cut through the Arctic wind. Military aircraft appeared on the horizon, Apache gunships, transport helicopters, and something larger that I couldn't immediately identify. "Ground team, this is Razor 6, came a voice over Bernie's military radio. We have visual on the hostile, beginning attack run. The lead Apache opened fire with its 30mm chain gun, the massive rounds stitching across the creature's body. Chunks of alien flesh exploded into the air, but the wounds began healing almost immediately. The creature's response was swift and devastating. A dozen parasites launched simultaneously from its mass, targeting the helicopter. Most missed, but one struck the Apache's tail rotor. The aircraft spun wildly before crashing into the lake in a ball of flame and twisted metal. All units, all units! The radio crackled with panicked voices. Conventional weapons are ineffective. Repeat, conventional weapons are ineffective. But the military wasn't giving up. The larger aircraft I'd spotted earlier was some kind of experimental bomber, and it was carrying something that made the air itself seem to vibrate. When it opened its bomb bay doors, I could see canisters marked with biohazard symbols. "Chemical weapons," Bernie said grimly. "They're going to sterilize the entire area." The bomber made its approach run, but the creature was learning. More parasites launched into the air, this time in a coordinated pattern designed to create a defensive screen. Several struck the bomber's wings and fuselage, their acid eating through the aircraft's hull. The bomber managed to release its payload before crashing, but only half the canisters reached their target. Chemical fire erupted across the creature's body, eating through its flesh like acid. For the first time, we heard it scream, a sound like tearing metal that echoed across the frozen wasteland. But even as parts of its body dissolved, the creature continued spawning parasites. The bombardment of organic projectiles intensified, and I watched in horror as several struck the remaining helicopters. Soldiers began transforming mid-flight, their aircraft crashing as mutated pilots lost control. Fabien was the next to fall. A parasite that had landed nearby launched itself at his face before any of us could react. I watched my friend's eyes go blank as the creature forced itself into his mouth, his body convulsing as the transformation began. Within minutes, Fabien Ting was attacking us with tentacles that erupted from his back. Holly tried to run, but she wasn't fast enough. The creature caught her with one appendage and began dragging her toward its mutating mouth. Bernie put 3 rounds center mass into what had been Fabien, but the bullets barely slowed it down. I grabbed a flare gun from our emergency kit and put a phosphorus round directly into Fabien Ting's head. The chemical fire finally stopped it, but not before Holly had been infected. "Peter," she gasped as the parasite began its work. You have to burn them all. It's the only way." I was alone now. Bernie had been caught by another projectile parasite while trying to reach the crashed Snowcat's weapon cache. The entire military response team was either dead or transformed, their twisted forms shambling across the battlefield. The mother creature continued to grow, absorbing the remains of its offspring and the bodies of the fallen. It was massive now, a living mountain of alien flesh that towered over the steaming lake. But I could see it was preparing for something else, a final metamorphosis that would allow it to reproduce on a scale that would consume the entire planet. That's when I remembered the emergency protocol that Station Alpha 7 had installed for exactly this scenario, a failsafe that none of us had wanted to consider. The tactical nuclear device hidden in our equipment bunker. Fighting my way through shambling human-parasite hybrids, I reached the bunker and entered the activation codes. The device was small, meant for containing biological threats rather than destroying cities. But it would be enough. As I set the timer for 5 minutes, I could hear the creature's final transformation beginning. The sound was like 1,000 voices screaming in harmony, punctuated by the wet tearing of flesh as it prepared to spawn a new generation. I made it less than a mile before the detonation lit up the Arctic sky. The fireball consumed everything, the creature, the ships, the lake, and every trace of the parasites that had waited so long to complete their life cycle. When the rescue teams found me 3 days later, I was the only survivor of an incident that officially never happened. The crater where the excavation site had been was filled with radioactive glass, and the Franklin ships were nothing but atomic shadows burned into the ice. They debriefed me for weeks, making me repeat the story until every detail was recorded and classified. Then they made me sign papers that officially erased my memory of events that the world could never know about. But I remember. I remember Eric's transformation, Nozick's possession, the sight of dozens of parasites merging into something that should not exist. I remember the sound they made as they died, Not the scream of animals, but something older. Something that had been waiting in the ice since before humans walked the Earth. The official report says that Station Alpha 7 was destroyed in a reactor accident. It says that the Franklin expedition remains lost, their fate one of history's great mysteries. But I know the truth. And sometimes, in the deepest part of winter when the wind howls like the voices of the dead, I wonder if we really got them all. Because somewhere in the Arctic, there are other ships buried in the ice. Other expeditions that vanished without a trace. Other things that might be waiting for someone curious enough to dig them up. And I pray that nobody ever does.